As the war turned against the Germans, and the Allies forced them back towards their homelands, they came across a number of different concentration camps. Inside of these were the last remaining parts of the SS Guards, and thousands of prisoners who were emaciated, starving and dying. Some of the worst concentration camps, such as Bergen-Belsen, were riddled with diseases, and the remains of inmates who had succumbed to the evil conditions were lying all around the site. But many of these camps were part of large complexes, with other subcamps serving them and housing inmates. One of these subcamps was Ebensee, which was part of the Mauthausen complex. Mauthausen became infamous for its evil treatment of the prisoners, and the stairs of death that were there, leading to a quarry where prisoners were forced to carry 50-kilogram pieces of granite up them. The conditions of Mauthausen were barbaric, and by the end of the war it's believed that the average life expectancy of inmates was just 3 months since when they entered the site. But Ebensee saw around 30,000 inmates held there, and around 1/3 of them would die. But as the site was liberated, reprisals were carried out against the remaining SS guards that stayed there. One man in particular, who was a guard, faced a terrifying and brutal end and execution, as the inmates took their revenge. Join us today as we look at the horrific execution of the SS guard burned alive, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Ebensee subcamp opened on the 18th of November 1943, and it was to serve as part of the Mauthausen complex. The main purpose of Ebensee was to provide slave labour for the construction and creation of huge tunnels, which would house armaments production safe underground, away from Allied bombing. This meant that the armaments production was protected underground and would not be blown up, and it also remained undetected. One tunnel was even a petrol refinery, so it was imperative that the SS kept this away from the bombs of the Allied aircraft. 27,278 men were sent to Ebensee, and around 8,500 and 11,000 died there. The inmate population was made up of 1/3 of Jews, and there were prisoners from many other countries held there. Along with the Mauthausen main camp, the death rates at the subcamps serving it were 3 times higher than at other sites, and the first commandant of Ebensee was George Bachmeier. He served for a few weeks until he was replaced. Later, SS Obersturmführer Otto Rehmer was in charge of the camp, and there were accounts from prisoners that Rehmer murdered and tortured inmates with his bare hands. He was caught shooting 8 prisoners whilst he was drunk, and because of this he was demoted and was then moved to work in the Gusen post office, away from the reins of command. But he was replaced by another brutal man, Anton Ganz, who was said to have been cruel, brutal and dictatorial. Inmates were forced to work long 11-hour shifts, but if they worked in the tunnel they did 8-hour stints, and production was 24 hours a day. Lice infested the camp, and there was very little in the way of comfort, just sawdust for inmates to sleep on. They got coffee for breakfast and hot water and gone-off potatoes for lunch, and a piece of bread and water for dinner. This caused a huge degree of starvation, and many other companies utilised the workers at the site, and the SS rented out workers to go and work for them, even if the inmates were dying. SS guards also appointed prisoner Kapos, who oversaw prisoners, and many of these were very brutal. One survivor recalled how the barracks were not heated, and that meals were not consistent. There were also no baths, and prisoners were very dirty, leading to disease spreading very quickly. As the Allies encroached upon different concentration camps, as the war turned against the Germans, the SS moved many prisoners to Ebensee, and overcrowding caused a huge problem, and there was not enough food to feed everyone. Prisoner doctors had no medical supplies, and many of the prisoners were dangerously ill. One transport of inmates arrived on the 3rd of March 1945, with 2,000 Jewish prisoners sent from Gross-Rosen, and the commandant forced them to stand outside for 2 days in the snowy weather, and hundreds of people died from exhaustion and exposure in the cold. The following month led to around 4,500 prisoner deaths, and the crematoria inside the camp could not cremate all the bodies, as there were simply too many. Because of this, mass graves were dug, with over 2,000 dead inmates buried there in secret. However, by May 1945, the prisoners of Ebensee, who managed to survive, could hear shooting in the distance. They had a feeling that the British or American soldiers were close by, and then on the 4th of May 1945, the commandant of the camp said that prisoners have been sold to the Americans. They were told to go and take protection and shelter inside the tunnels at the camp. but the prisoners refused to do this, and they remained in their barracks. But hours later some of the tunnels were exploded, as the SS guards detonated mines there. The plan was for the inmates to be inside the tunnels when they were blown up. But the following day the SS had mostly deserted Ebensee, and there were mostly only elderly German men armed with rifles guarding the site. As the Americans arrived at the camp, the prisoners turned on the camp functionaries and Kapos, as well as the last few guards who remained, and they killed 52 collaborators or Nazis. But there was one execution which was carried out on a former guard, which was considered incredibly brutal and shocking. Clearly the people of the camp were suffering, and they wanted to get even against those who had imprisoned them and made their lives a misery. Benjamin B. Ferenc, one of the prosecutors of the Nuremberg Trial, investigated the horrors of Ebensee, and he was furious at what the Nazis had done there. However, he heard a story of one SS guard who had tried to flee. He heard that this guard was then captured, and he was then tied to a metal tray, which was used to transport bodies into the crematorium. He then discovered that the prisoners then lit the oven, and they slowly roasted the SS guard to death, and his screams could be heard throughout the camp. This guard was even brought in and out of the oven a number of times, to make his ordeal much worse. Ferenc said he was in no position to stop the mob's actions, and he claimed that he did not try, as he saw it as adequate revenge for the prisoners, and he said, "There seemed to be no limit to human brutality and warfare." Ferenc knew it was legal for the mob to hand over this German SS soldier to the Americans under military law, but he saw more horror and reprisal inside Ebensee. He later recalled the execution of the SS guard who was burned alive once more, and he said, "I once saw DPs beat an SS man and then strap him to a steel gurney of a crematorium. They slid him in the oven, turned on the heat and took him back out, beat him again, and put him back in until he was burned alive. I did nothing to stop it. I suppose I could have brandished my weapon or shot in the air, but I was not inclined to do so. Does that make me an accomplice to murder?" He recalled the execution in his final years, and it's clear he must have been haunted by what he saw at Ebensee. But this story was corroborated by other Allied liberators, and one stated, "In another nearby camp at Ebensee, slaves were used to dig large chambers out of the granite mountain as underground workshops for the aircraft industry. I directed a group of passing Germans to help bury the bodies of inmates strewn along the camp grounds. There some inmates caught one of the SS guards as he was trying to flee. Judging by the violence of the assault, he may have been the camp commandant. First he was beaten mercilessly, then the mob tied him to one of the metal trays used to slide bodies into the crematorium. There he was slowly roasted alive, taking him in and out of the oven several times. I watched it and did nothing. It was not my duty to stop it, even if I could have, and frankly, I was not inclined to try. I headed back to Munich to write my reports. They would serve as a basis for later war crimes prosecutions. I was grateful that the war was coming to an end. I learned that there has never been, and never will, be a war without atrocities. The only way to prevent such cruel crimes is to prevent war itself. The Allied liberators, it's believed, did very little to stop the reprisals against SS guards, and also more would recount the story of the burned alive SS guard. Another liberator of Ebensee said, "By noon there was no order in the camp. The masses took to emptying the food stores. The Kapos, block leaders and Schreibers had disappeared. The inmates remembered all the cruelty of the crowned elite, and retribution began. From one of our hospital windows we watched how these anointed camp leaders fled past the barbed wire from the throng. The guards did not shoot after them. The longest search was for the Kapo called Tishan, named Hartmann. He could not hide himself in time. He was pulled from outside the fence and was thrown live into the crematorium. The search was then on for the high-ranking Kapo from Melk, also called Tishan, who during his reign had gutted hundreds of inmates alive. But this monster, known to so many, did escape the people's justice and was tried by military court only after the war. Jean Lafitte, a French inmate, wrote in his memoirs that 52 functionaries of the camp died at the hands of this primeval justice, but by evening the camp was calm. The story of the guard who was brutally executed inside of the crematoria kept appearing, and further American liberators commented on it. Another said, "In scenes repeated at other concentration camps across what was left of the Reich, the inmates of Ebensee then turned against those who remained of their captors." Moshe Hart Elion recounted that one of these was a Kapo, a prisoner in charge of supervising the camp labour. He was notorious for his cruelty. He was captured by a group of Russian-Ukrainian Jews who then joined a lynch mob. They beat the Kapo to the ground and stoned him until he seemed dead. They then set off carrying him to the camp's crematorium through the cordon of cadavers. The Kapo regained consciousness and began to struggle. Someone shouted, "Let's burn him alive." He cried in horror, seeing the end that awaits him. He was dragged to the crematorium and thrown onto the iron stretcher, used for offering the bodies to the furnace, shouting and screaming at the top of his voice. Someone took out a long bar, which served the purpose of pushing the corpses from the carriage into the oven, and thrust a hook into the Capo's groin, and pushed his body into the oven. The oven door was shut. Their cries were heard no more. Each of these different accounts told the same story, that an SS guard or Kapo was tied to a metal stretcher and was slowly roasted alive, being brought in and out of the furnace so his screams could be heard. They inflicted brutal revenge upon him, and the prisoners believed they were doing the right thing, and of course the liberators were powerless to do anything about this sort of behaviour. It was the American troops of the 80th Infantry Division that arrived at the camp, and they were greeted by starving and emaciated inmates, and they were disgusted by what they saw. Hundreds were dying each day, and many of the liberators could not process how the Nazis could treat people in such a barbaric way. But the story of the Kapo or the guard who was roasted in the oven at Ebensee was also barbaric, but for some prisoners it brought closure and revenge. There were very few guards of the camp that were ever brought to justice, and this man who was roasted alive could have been one of those who was brought to trial for his crimes. But this would not be the case, and his death took place at the hands of those who suffered so much. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.